Martin Queinnec.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Martin Queinnec. I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Nicolas Scoops at UBC, University of British Columbia. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about airborne single-photon LiDAR, which has been specifically designed for broad-scale mapping, and some... That's a slide changing. And some first results I got on the approaches to assess canopy cover, canopy penetration of single-photon LiDAR over a range of forest structures. So, as you know, ALS used to assess forest composition and structure is very important for many applications. But when we want to go broad scale, and by broad scale I mean like country-wide or region-wide, there's usually a trade-off between the point cloud density and the range accuracy of the point cloud and the altitude at which we can acquire the data, and therefore the time and the costs. So the general goal is to increase the overall coverage of the acquisition while maintaining or even improving the point density and the accuracy of the point cloud. And this has been made possible recently with single-photon detections. So on the right of the figure here, you can see a conventional discrete photon LiDAR, which is basically using a single laser beam operated in a near-infrared, and we measure the amount of photons that are returned with this single beam as we get through the canopy. The approach is slightly different with single-photon LiDAR, where we actually use lower energy beams, and we measure the amount of beams that return to the detector. So you can see on this figure here that within a single shot, I mean, in the same amount of time, we would have more returns from the single-photon LiDAR, and we might have less canopy penetration. So single-photon LiDAR can be operated at higher altitudes and speeds because basically the detectors don't need as many photons to record a return. And that's why we can fly higher and faster. The data I'm using for my research comes from the SPL100, which has been recently released. And in this table, I'm listing a few key specifications and differences between the SPL100 and a conventional LiDAR. One of the main ones being the wavelengths. So for SPL, we use a green wavelength compared to the usual near-infrared. The pulse width is much lower because we have lower energy pulses. And very importantly, within a single laser pulse, so there's an optical device that splits the pulses into a 10 by 10 array of beamlets, which basically increases the amount of pulses in the air. And the point density we can get, so at around 4,000 meter altitude, we can get around 20 points per square meter with SPL. As a comparison with a conventional LiDAR, the same altitude we would get at least half, like 1.5 to 5 points per square meter. And finally, the SPL, you can actually detect per single beamlets. You can detect up to 5 returns per beam, so there's a multiple echo capability here as well. To summarize, basically some advantages of drawbacks of SPL. So, as I said, there is a higher error coverage, higher point cloud density. However, there is a much lower signal-to-noise ratio because single-photon detectors are much more sensitive to background solar noise. So this requires additional processing steps that I will not cover here. Like the data that I got was already, filtered. And there are some concerns about the range accuracy of the datasets, both from the sensor itself, but also from the filtering process. And also the concerns about the penetration of pulses through the canopy, both because we use low energy pulses, but also green wavelengths, which reflect less when they're near-infrared over vegetation. So my study area is located in Ontario, in Canada. It's called the Romeo Malette Forest. It's about 630,000 hectares of boreal forest. So you can see pretty much opened compared to what we could find here. And I'm focusing this presentation on a subset here in orange, which is a provincial park, and I selected this area to have as little disturbances as possible when comparing two ALS acquisitions. So the first one was acquired in 2004-2005 with the ALS40 at 2,700 meters altitude, which is pretty high for a conventional LiDAR, and we get a very low point density of 0.5 meters. As a comparison, the data that was acquired last year at 4,000 meters elevation has a average point density of 22 points per meter. In this transect here, you can see in green the SPL transect, like the point cloud, and in red the transect the same position but with the ALS40. So, which approaches do I use to assess the canopy penetration? So, for now, I've looked mostly at the percentages of near ground returns. By near ground, I mean every point that is in between 15 centimeters of the surface. And I divided that by the number of all returns. So this gives a ratio of how many pulses are getting actually to the ground. The second metric is a median height of last returns, and this gives information of how deep the pulses can go through the vegetation. And for now, I compare in this presentation these two metrics again, canopy cover and vegetation type as a percentage of coniferous tree versus deciduous trees. And these vegetation types are derived from polygon level data, from photo interpreted data. And so how does it look like? So in the first figure on the left, you can see the LPI, so the ratio of ground returns, as a function of canopy cover. And as we increase in canopy cover, so both sensors have a decreasing laser penetration index, which makes sense. But in every class of canopy, most of the canopy cover classes, the ALS40 has higher laser penetration. If we look at the median height of last returns, again against canopy cover, we can see that approximately around 50 to 60%, the median height of last returns the difference between the two starts to increase greatly. If we look at the vegetation type influence, so on the x-axis here as a percentage of coniferous trees, so as we move to the right here we have coniferous dominated stands, here deciduous. We can see that actually for SPL, there seems to be that coniferous dominated stands have a higher LPI than deciduous stands, especially for canopy cover between 20 to 60%. The difference is a bit less significant in very dense stands. The relationship between the vegetation type and LPI is not as significant with the ALS40. And we can see again, if we compare the colors here, that on average, the ALS has a higher laser penetration index than the SPL. So a few main results to summarize. So we've seen that the SPL has a higher median height of last returns than the ALS40, especially for high canopy covers. The LPI of ALS40 is constantly higher than the one of the SPL100, and that coniferous stands are basically easier to penetrate for the SPL. However, if we look at this figure here, where we actually look at the number of ground returns in a 10 by 10 meter cell, we can see that in any type of canopy cover class, the density of SPL is so high that we get around 100 times more returns than the conventional LiDAR, 2.5 points per square meter. So some further direction for my work. So I will try to find other approaches to assess canopy penetration, and I'm soon going to have some field data that might provide me independent data to compare to. And I will try to provide a full characterization of the point cloud so that we can check like the weaving canopy vegetation metrics to develop new type of metrics that can maximize the information content of the point cloud, and in order to assess the suitability of the SPL to be used regularly in forest inventories frameworks. So thank you very much, and I'm open for any question.